Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you all for coming. It's not long now till free network and drinks, so bear with us and we can enjoy them together. So I want to start the session by thanking AKW for their level of sponsorship. It's really important that when putting on a show like this and making it free to attend, which is a relatively unique opportunity in the current climate, that businesses and companies like that sponsor the session. So I want to thank them before I start. But also, in sponsoring this specific session, thank them just for letting me relatively just get on with organising the presentation. So they were very keen for it not to look or be salesy, which is really good, and it shows how much integrity that they have. So hopefully there'll be some good OT content for you. Good. So a little bit more about me. Director of UK Therapy Services. I'm a head OT for some inpatient services in Northumberland. I'm also an associate of the OT service with Kate Sheehan, everybody knows that service. I graduated in 2007 from Northumbria University. On graduation, I got a rotational post in North Tyneside, did that for a couple of years, moved into emergency care for 4 years, which was split by a year, seconded into a rehab site to support its development. 2 years ago, past August, I began managing services in the community based in inpatient rehab units, and 18 months ago had the acute service added into that. For the last 4 years, I've been an associate of Kate Sheehan's in the OT service, which is who we organise the theatres through. Just realised that the glasses are on my head and I definitely need to have them on, which is pretty ironic given the content of the session, isn't it? But as you can tell from those sorts of clinical experiences, I'm not someone who could really consider themselves a specialist in visual impairment in the truest sense. However, over the last few years, I've become increasingly involved with projects which involve the environment, both as inpatient and in the community. We've done a lot of work around falls reduction and dementia. The research involved with this, alongside seeing a lecture presented by Bethan Collins, sparked an interest in visual impairment specifically, and it's with this specialist interest hat on that I speak today. What I want the session to be is something that stimulates discussion. So there may be people in here watching who think, I know that, I do that already. There might be snippets of information that you think, actually, I knew I did that, but didn't quite know why. But there'll be lots of things, lots of people in this auditorium who have got more experience in this area than I have, and actually can help me with that, which would be great. So what I would like to do is, and it was mentioned there briefly, after the session, I won't take Q&A here, but what I will do is I'll be on AKW stand for around about an hour after the session. So if anybody wants to come and tell me about your experiences, ask me any questions about the session, then that's where we'll do that. So what do we want to do? What do we want to achieve today? We're going to define visual impairment. I want to increase our awareness of the environmental factors and their impact on low vision, consider how occupational performance can be supported throughout the home, and explore areas of increased risk and how they can be reasonably minimised. So defining visual impairment, the two definitions there are a limitation of one or more functions of the eye or visual system, and now you can be registered as sight impaired, which was previously partially sighted, or severely sight impaired, which was previously blind. As you can see from the definitions, certainly the first definition, it's very broad and opens the term visual impairment up to a vast number of presentations not necessarily associated directly with eye conditions. It's important therefore that we consider visual impairment and the impact of the environment not simply as an age-related condition or where there need to be specific optical diagnoses, but as a standard part of every single assessment that we conduct. Let's get some stats. Approximately 2 million people in the UK have sight loss that impacts on their everyday life. Of these 2 million, around 650,000 are registered as blind or as partially sighted based on the definition we just previously had. The cost to the NHS of falls associated with visual impairment is at least £25.1 million per annum, and around 1 in 7 of over 65s are living with what can be termed significant sight loss, and by 75, at least 2.5% of the population will be living with visual impairment and dementia. The last fact is quite important, given some of the items that we're going to discuss, as there are a number of recommendations which support both visual acuity and cognitive impairment separately in their own right. So there's a lot of overlap. As you can see, there's a drop in percentage from around 15% in over 65s to 2.5% in over 75s. But that's as the over 75 statistic is those presenting with visual impairment and dementia. So because you're combining two different clinical diagnoses, the percentage then drops. It's generally accepted that there are 5 key areas to consider within the home environment, which we will review and then apply practically to particular rooms. So what I want to do is look at those 5 key areas separately in their own right, and then go through some practical tips within each room about how we can apply them, or things we should be considering within somebody's individual environment. It'll be on the OT Show website, the presentation will be. And it's being filmed as well, much to my absolute despair. So I'll be able to watch it back myself and hear my own voice. But yeah, it'll definitely be available. So you don't need to scribble lots of things down. It's quite all right. So the first key area is education. People generally know where they would like to improve their home, but they don't always know how to do it, or why they want to do it, or why it should be that way, and that's what they've been help with. It's important to be able to provide accurate information and advice, empowering them to make informed decisions. I know it sounds obvious to us as OTs that the client is at the centre of everything we do. Don't take that for granted. It seems like it's obvious, but it isn't for everybody. However, it may be in this particular area that it's even more critical than any other, because where somebody would place something or somebody's own routine is absolutely critical that we support that and not change it, otherwise will impact on the level of dysfunction. The client is the expert in themselves, and it's critical that we attempt to help them solve the problem within what they consider to be normal. So don't try and change what they consider to be normal. You know, you'll be sitting there thinking that's absolutely blindingly obvious, but we do see it. We do see it in practice where we go in and give some advice about making some changes, and don't always necessarily consider, certainly within visual impairment, the potential negative connotations to that. Second key area is lighting. Good lighting can support safety and security, for example, access and egress. I think that's relatively self-explanatory. Orientation, by clearly identifying which room the individual is in, and support independent functioning. One of the most efficient and effective ways to support these aspects is by utilising task lighting. This is the idea that lighting should support activities rather than illuminate a general space. There should be sufficient light to facilitate maximise occupational performance for those specific tasks. So for example, consider your kitchen or bathroom at home. You might have lights built in the underside of cupboards where it lights your benches up, for example. It's a similar concept, but where specific object or areas that tasks are performed rather than the general space that's lit. So if you think those downlighters in your kitchen light up workspace, it's thinking about that in a similar way, but thinking actually what tasks are being done there and in what area. So rather than lighting a room or lighting a bench, it's which part of the bench, which part of the room, which utilities does it highlight. And if you think about it in a strange sort of way, lighting's come full circle. Task lighting was all that was available before electric general lights were available. So things like candles, kerosene lamps were used. They are highlighted specific areas of the room, areas that were obviously the most important because that's why they were lit. Then came a tendency to light a full room and use nice dimmer switches. But we normally use dimmer switches to either affect mood, so mood lighting, or atmosphere than task. So lighting up a room doesn't support a completion of a task. It supports a general space to be illuminated. Now, however, we're able to use task lighting electronically, with better quality bulbs which also light the room sufficiently. So you're able to task light as well as illuminate and give enough illumination to the room to make the rest of it safe. But you're lighting up a specific area to support a specific task. The single most important thing that I learned when first researching lighting and visual impairment is that halving the distance between the light and the object you're lighting increases visual acuity by 4. So if you halve the distance, so at the minute you might have a big light in your sitting room, you have a big light in the middle of the room. If you halve the distance between that light and where you were completing the task, that increases your visual acuity by 4. That's massive. So it's being aware of where lighting is and actually what its aim is within a room. It's also very important when considering the lighting within a room that we consider the impact of glare. We all know we've been sitting at a computer for too long with the sunlight in an office beaming in through the window and you end up with a headache. It's the same principle, except within visual impairment it can be quite confusing. So glare stops, in some circumstances, allowing you to see an object or see a space clearly enough, which then is obviously going to have an impact on efficiency of occupational performance. So ensure we recommend non-reflective materials and use lampshades or window blinds for glare caused by natural light. Like I say, I think that's probably something we would kind of do anyway, but it's being aware of why we're doing it. Okay, key area 3, colour and contrast. If there's any one single thing you take away from this today, it's the importance of contrast. And we all I think we all have a general knowledge of contrast, and we know that there are certain signs that are yellow on black, and we kind of accept that must be because the numbers, the two colours contrast each other well. But do we know why? And do you know that it's not, you don't just have to use something like yellow and black. So on the seats, and if you haven't got one left on the seat, they're in a holder on the AKW stand. Based on some feedback I gave to AKW last year, they produced this. So that's a leaflet that explains light reflective value. So it explains how colour selection is important and ensuring contrast is sufficient to support occupational performance with somebody with a visual deficit. So the important thing to remember is that using colours that reflect light and have a greater value difference of 30 LRV, so it's light reflective value, help differentiate an object from its surroundings. So if you can see from the leaflet, every single colour, so this is just an example, but every colour has a light reflective value. And the reason they use signs as black and yellow is because black light reflective value is 0 and yellow's is 36. You don't want to be using colours that have a difference of less than 30, because then they don't contrast well enough. So because yellow and black's 36, that's seen to be good enough to create contrast. That's why lots of signs are yellow and black. But it doesn't mean you're limited to that. You can use any colour in any circumstance, in any room, as long as the LRV is greater than 30. And obviously the greater the difference, the better it is for visual acuity. And we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But if you haven't got one of them, they're on the AKW stand, so come and meet me afterwards and I'll make sure you get one. Colour contrast, it's best achieved, and this was at first, when I first started looking at this, it was a little bit of a surprise. The colour contrast is best achieved with contrasting shades of the same colour, rather than different colours of the same shade. And I couldn't really get my head around that. I don't know if it's because I don't make any decisions about decorating in my house. I didn't even decide that we wanted to buy the house, let alone decorate it. So I've got no idea what colours go with what. But using the same shade of a different colour isn't good enough. You're better off using contrasting shades of the same colour, as long as the light reflective value is greater than 30. Do you get what I mean? If you don't, or I haven't explained that properly, again, come and grab me afterwards and I'll try it again. Still, the common thought about things like grab rails are that red rails and fixtures are the colour of choice. Normally when I say something like that in these sessions, I see people kind of looking quizzically as if to say, I've never heard that. When I'm out asking people or doing research on it, the number of people who still say, well, red shouldn't red be the colour of choice for things like grab rails and things is absolutely astonishing. It's not necessarily the case. I can't quite work out exactly where it's come from, but I have a theory. It seems to be based on research that was conducted specifically around dementia-friendly environments. But as the first slide suggested, only 2.5% of the population over 75 are going to have a significant visual impairment and dementia. The issue in the research around red rails and fixings wasn't specifically about visual impairment, it was exploring the dementia-friendly bathrooms, but I think there's then been a bit of a crossover and other research that's kind of reinforced the use of those colours, and it's become, in some people's eyes, the colour for visual impairment in something like a bathroom, but it isn't the case at all. Go back to your light reflective value, you can use whatever colour you want, as long as the value is greater than 30. There are obviously, however, some colours that reflect light more than others, or there wouldn't be any contrast, which is why things like diving apparatus are likely to be orange, as they can be seen in greater water depths. So single colours have with a higher light reflective value are going to be used where there are darker spaces, or in that example, somebody who dives is going down to dark depths. They're going to use something with a very high light reflective value, but we're not talking about colour value here, we're talking about contrast value. So it always goes back to that level of greater than 30. But it's something that needs to be thought about in a lot more depth than I think we do, generally. And it shouldn't just be thinking about somebody who has a specific visual impairment. I think it's something that we should be considering as part of our general assessment for everybody that we see. So key area 4, clutter. There should be plenty of space to create safe and logical routes. However, you need to make sure that you're supporting what is logical for the person and not for yourself. So it goes back to that original slide about making them, the client being at the centre of everything. We can't say what the logical route for something is. It's their home, they've probably walked that same logical route or gone to the same cupboard for something for their entire lives. What's logical to us is absolutely not logical to them. Storage should be easily accessible to save inefficient searching. So that's relatively self-explanatory. If you move something, you're not going to know where nobody's going to know where it is. I couldn't find any different pictures for clutter either. That looks like, I wouldn't necessarily call that clutter, it looks like nice stuff in an old farm barn. It's to represent clutter. And the fifth key area, accessibility. So where are you going to find stuff? So equipment and appliances should be easy to locate and where the individual would expect to find them. It goes back to the very first slide where I mentioned the importance of not imposing routine, and the previous slide. Not imposing routine or ideas, but supporting individuals who know themselves better than we do, and where they would habitually find or search for the item. Where possible or required, consider the need for controls on tactile devices and appliances to be tactile or audible. I think what we do pretty well normally is think about whether things can be tactile. So I think most of us are probably somewhere along the line in a situation where you can put something where someone's got to feel how far they turn the microwave dial or the oven dial or something like that. We're pretty good at that, but make sure that you keep up to date with what's on the market, because I wouldn't particularly want some bumpy sticker stuck on my oven or my microwave. For one, it highlights that there's a potential problem, but there are lots of devices out there that support that without it being incredibly obvious or having some bright orange bump on stuck on my Chrome microwave. There are lots of audible devices that do exactly the same thing, where they can be programmed so they tell somebody when they've turned it where they need to turn it to, and nobody hears it but them. And there's exhibitors out there who provide that sort of equipment, so make sure you think creatively. It's alright, she told me she was going to go beforehand. I said I'd call her out for it. You're welcome. She's not being rude. Okay, so they're the 5 key areas. So now what I want to do is explore them within the context of what we would consider to be the normal living environment. So what constitutes good practice and how do we implement those key areas? It's all well and good knowing what those key areas are, but how do we actually put that into practice? So the areas we're going to explore are the kitchen, reception room, so living and dining room. I apologise if I use language for rooms that is different to what other people use, but you're going to get the gist. Stairs, bathroom, entrances and bedrooms. So this is an example of a kitchen. So when you're thinking about the logical layout, with items used most frequently, most accessible, so the things that I use most have them somewhere simple and obvious. Again, obvious for that person. In this particular picture, you've got colour contrast from the cupboard fascia, the appliances, the flooring, the walls and the tiling. I've said minimal reflective surfaces because the floor there is too shiny for me. As soon as you start using task lighting and things, if this was specifically around visual impairment, and it's not, it's also for other things like being wheelchair accessible. I'm just trying to use it as an example. But you can see how the colour contrast from the walls to the work surfaces to the benches is quite, it stands out. And they all have a colour contrast figure of greater than 30 LVR. The only thing within that picture I'd question, purely from a visual impairment perspective, is the colour of the glare on the floor, but the colour of the handles. So the chrome handles to the white fascia, that won't have an LVR of greater than 30. So if this were specifically being designed for visual impairment, I would look to change that. Being creative. So do the cupboards need hinge open doors? You know, do you think about the space you're working in? So when I've talked about the handles, do the cupboards need to open outward like that? You're thinking about the space you've got. Creatively, there are cupboard doors that slide or fold away. Do there even need to be doors on them if it's a problem? Does there even need to be a cupboard door? What problem does it create or what problem does it solve? If it's a massive problem, then stop thinking about it from our perspective and how your kitchen would be. So if there's a problem finding something, make it as obvious as you possibly can. There's a good level of natural light in that kitchen, as well as down lighting, which lights the cooker and the sink. So it's more difficult to tell in that picture because there's a lot of natural light. But in this particular kitchen, there are separate downlighters from the ceiling, which is just out of shot, which are specifically highlighting the cooker, the sink, and a specific area of the workstation. And it's lighting the room as a consequence. When we think of items, we often think of things like crockery, cutlery, but actually what we need to be thinking of are things that are just as important or that constitute the bulk of that task are things like the cooker and the sink. So it's the big appliances. The living room. So everything we've previously mentioned. In addition, is most of the furniture against a wall? Are things, so by that I mean, are we maximising the space? Is the person maximising the space that they've got? Going to lots of rooms and it's instinct to have sofas and chairs that point at the TV and they're all in a sort of square, which means somebody has to feel their way around and look for gaps. And if that's the way they've always done things, then absolutely fine. But are we using the space as well as it can be used? Are those circulation routes obstacle free? Can the lighting controls be manually adjusted to support different tasks? Is there task lighting without trailing flexes that illuminate specific areas of the room? So again, this is probably the room where you're most likely to see a big light, as Peter Kay would say, where it's on and off, and there might be a lamp in the corner, and it might have a dimmer switch so that you can change the atmosphere depending on what the time of day. But again, task lighting is absolutely critical. So where does the person sit? Is that specific space, is that chair, that space lit in the right way? To help somebody see the TV, or where they're using a TV remote, is that area specifically lit? Is the walkway specifically lit, or are we just putting higher wattage bulbs in a central space? Sockets and controls, are they positioned to avoid the need to move furniture to access them? And are they clearly contrasted? So it's a big one from a falls perspective as well. So I think we're quite good with things like trailing flexors. It's kind of fairly obvious, is the person going to trip over them? But lots of the rooms that I see, and I include my own in that, it's not something I specifically have to think of, but if I did, we try and hide sockets and plugs, like for lamps and things, with a chair. So you put a chair or a sofa or a dresser or something in front of a plug so that it's more aesthetically pleasing. It's no good at being aesthetically pleasing if you can't find it. So is it obvious? Do they need to be on the floor? You know, if you're designing a room, can they be at a height where the person isn't going to have to search for them? And do the sockets themselves, do they contrast against the wall? So you use a magnolia paint and a white plug. Again, go back to your light reflective values. Everything that needs to be used in that room, you need to consider the light reflective value. This area in particular needs to be personalised, because you all use the space so differently. So everything that I'm saying is kind of if you were starting from scratch, whereas obviously I accept that everyone's going to have their own routines and their own ways of doing things. So finding out how people use the space is critical in helping them decide where things like light should be. And that's the bit that we do well, or we should do well. That's how we gather the information. So when we meet somebody for the first time, then we should be asking the questions, what is your routine? But not just daily routine, your routine within this room. What are your preferences? What do you go to first? And it's also worth considering, is the role of that room going to change in time? If the role of the room changes, then the lighting needs to be able to change with it. So that might be based on age, degeneration. It could be a room that's currently being used as an office for someone to study in, and then they're going to move out. Or you could be using it as an office, and then you're going to retire. You need to be able to think flexibly about if that room's going to. Because we're not just talking about visual impairment from an elderly perspective. This is absolutely anybody. So what is the role of that room now, and what is the role of that room going to be in the future? And do you have enough flexibility to change things like lighting and contrast as the role changes? Staircases, again, as everything that we've previously talked about stands, but open stair rises don't support depth perception at all. Consistent height and depth of step are important. Colour contrast from the leading edge of the step is really important. So if you imagine looking down a flight of stairs, this particular flight of stairs, seeing those wooden steps and then seeing the floor at the bottom, if you had some form of visual impairment, it may be incredibly difficult for you to perceive that depth. So you tend to see it outside, but or where there are a single step up or down to a bathroom or kitchen, and people put some tape or something on it just to contrast. It's exactly the same idea, except I don't think we do that automatically or consider it automatically on flights of stairs. And it's quite difficult with things like wooden or laminate floors. If it's the same flooring up the stairs and you get to the bottom step and you don't know where that bottom step is, and we've all been in a situation at some point in our lives, visual impairment or not, where you haven't realised that the last step's there and it's 2 o'clock in the morning or something, and you're over. Exactly the same. But it's also the banister plays a really important part on stairs. Is the person using the banister in a way that supports their safety? So would they prefer to have the banister end at the bottom step, so before they take the step, so that they know that's the last one? Or actually, if they're a bit more anxious, or they have some physical issue with mobility or falls as well, actually should the banister be longer so that it ends after the last step? They're relatively sensible and simple things to consider, but how the person uses the banister to support their depth perception is really important. They might not want you putting tape or adaptations on that staircase. They might just say, we've spent an absolute fortune getting this nice floor and I absolutely love it. And I don't want people to walk into my house and see tape on the edge of each step. I wouldn't want that. So then really simple techniques about, okay, how do you use the banister then? Where does your banister end? Is there anything we can put on the banister that gives you a pre-indication that you're coming towards the end? Or on each step, can you use on the underside of the banister, if somebody's gripping it in a certain way, you know, like you get a rundown to a junction on a road, you get the 300-yard dash sign, then the 200 and then a 100. Is there something creatively you can do for that person where other people wouldn't even necessarily see it or consider it, that helps them know where each step is and certainly know where the top and bottom step are? Because that's relatively simple, it's relatively creative, but it also means that nobody else will be any the wiser. Bathroom. Okay, so there's an example of a bathroom. It needs to have like every other room, it needs to have a logical layout with space to move around safely. This is a good example of a bathroom that has good colour contrast. You think about the positioning of the sink and the toilet and the bath or the shower, etc. The boundaries of the walls to the floor contrast, and they have a light effective value of over 30. The only thing I sometimes have a problem with, or people tell me they have a difficulty with, is where there are wet rooms and the flooring comes up the wall, to create the seal. That for some people is difficult for them to then find a boundary for the room. And this isn't just about visual impairment. This can then go into some specifically neurological conditions, or that's why I'm saying it's not just about visual impairment. There's so much overlap. And you find it for some types of dementia as well, like a Lewy body dementia or something, where they're struggling with depth perception. If the floor comes up the room, I understand why it does, it's to seal it, but it doesn't create the boundary that the eye or the brain needs. So if you're designing one, again, from scratch with someone, it's worth asking the question, does that need to be there? And if it does need to be there, then can you create one that creates that contrast? So rather than it being the same as the floor, can it be the same as the floor till halfway up, and then, can they create a striped border? Or can they create it so that it's just a completely different colour, and with the same reflective value, and it shows the person where the floor ends and the wall starts? Just, everyone's going to be totally different, but they're just some of the things that are on an individual basis are a little bit more difficult. Things like supporting an occupation in the bathroom with other items, like towels. So if somebody's having to search for things that they need in that bathroom, it's not just about fixtures and fittings and lighting, it's what else needs to be contrasted. So somebody in that shower with pale blue or grey towels or something hanging over that rail might then struggle to pick that up. So it's giving them some advice about every single thing that they use can have that light reflective value for contrast applied to it. So can they be using other things in that environment that support their ability to see the object more clearly? Thermostatic controls reduce scalding risks. Matte finishes are preferable to reduce glare. And task lighting needs to be used to illuminate specific areas in the room to spot which ones. It's not just about the position of the toilet, but contrasting parts of the object. For example, the toilet seat, the taps, the toilet flush. I think we're normally pretty good with things like different coloured toilet seats. That kind of seems to be relatively well ingrained. But again, it's, do you know why you use specific colours? And again, it should all go back to that light reflective value. The toilet roll is not the right colour. No. Yep. But it's taking it down to that detail. So if somebody is, you see somebody struggling to find it, a very simple fix of that is get a different colour toilet roll. That contrasts the white wall, the white fixture, and yeah, it probably is. I haven't actually seen it myself, ironically, but thank you. But yeah, and it's just an example. So everybody's going to be totally different. Somebody at that toilet might not have any problem finding the toilet roll, they might not even need to see it because it's always where they've gone to. They might not need it to be a different colour at all. So I'm just trying to use the pictures as examples. So if somebody has a specific problem with a specific part of a task, consider what you can do about the detail before you dive into making some bigger changes and adaptations. Because it could just be something as simple as, with a different colour, help. So I mentioned a shower with thermostatic controls. So this is, and I put a picture on here and then I've just realised it's over my right shoulder. This is an example of what I mean by electric thermostatic shower. So this is the AKWI Care, which is an example of the shower. You can see it here, and it's also on a stand. You can come and have a play with it. As well as being the world's first Bluetooth smart electric shower, which means it can be controlled by an iPad app. It also has excellent additional features for someone with a visual impairment, potentially. So such as illuminated temperature and flow indicators, which you can see better over my shoulder. It lights up, and the letters are all raised. So illuminated temperature and flow indicators, easy to locate, and push buttons and controls that give auditory feedback on use. So when you press the button, it tells you what you're doing. It's a really clever bit of kit. It's also got no externally heated piping, so it reduces the risk of scalding. But like I say, you can actually have a play with it on the stand if you want to. It's excellent. So other areas to consider, so you've got the entrance to the property, where one of the initial things is considering security, fear, anxiety. Someone certainly with a more significant visual impairment might just have that real boundary fear of, how do I know who I'm letting in or who's at my door? That can be sometimes resolved with very simple lighting. In the bedroom, I haven't gone into an awful lot of detail because it just gets very repetitive. It's very similar to the kitchen because potentially you've got wardrobes, basically where you need to consider the fascia, the flooring, the lighting. Again, it's task lighting, so what are you doing in that room? Where are you going to light it? So from a detail point of view, there's nothing really to add from a bedroom perspective. Refer to all of the points that we've previously discussed. It's all about lighting, contrast, flooring, glare. So what I wanted just to quickly do was just to list some of the things, because it can be, I think we can get quite blasé about an activity analysis that we perform for everybody that we see, just because it's so innate, or it should be so innate, that we do it, and it's about thinking about why we do things and the things that it can support. So from a components perspective, the things that some of these recommendations can impact on are, and this list is not exhaustive, but it demonstrates what can be impacted on by very simple environmental recommendations, showing that it's not only pure visual impairment where they can support an individual. So this is from an activity analysis perspective. So if you look at the things that are listed there, things like inattention, initiation, problem solving, recognition, figure ground, colour constancy, they're not things that are only limited to somebody with a visual impairment. That could be anybody that you see, that you apply an activity analysis to objectively, and you realise that they have some difficulties with those things. Could be for any reason at all, but the things that we've discussed can have a positive impact on those issues. And like I say, it's absolutely not exhaustive. So again, much of what we discussed supports not only visual impairment, but also dementia-friendly environments and other neurological deficits, but anything, absolutely anything that that you see that is where your activity analysis highlights some of the areas that were on the previous slide. Although there may be some focus on risk reduction, so say falls and things, for example, we need to support positive risk taking, and therefore the advice given is also to maximise function. With risks reduced, the individual may be more likely to engage in meaningful occupation they had become fearful of attempting independently. So this isn't about highlighting where there are risks and trying to take the risks away. It's about supporting those risks being taken safely, because every single task that we complete in our own homes has some risk attached. It's how do we support that person in achieving what they would class as normal routine, not our own routine, their own. And I think that's me done. So I'm not going to take questions here, if that's okay, but I will be on AKW stand for an hour after this, or for however long I need to be. So please feel free to come and say hello. Tell me if you've got any experiences that contrast some of the things, that are different to what I've said. It'd be really interesting to hear your experiences. But also, if you've got any questions about what I've said, then come and ask them. I've also got all the resources. If you haven't got one of these, make sure over the next 2 days you take one home, because I think it's probably the most critical thing to take away from the 45-minute session. And thank you again to AKW. Thank you.